Will you believe it if I told you that a marriage began not out of love, but because of a debt? And what if that person you considered a lifelong burden one day becomes your most solid pillar? And what if that place you saw as your prison turns out to be the spot where you finally find yourself? Today's story isn't scandalous, but it contains a deep human warmth, tears, and a silent hope more intense than any other. It is the story of a young woman who, due to AA, had to marry a paraplegic man. On her first wedding night, she tried to flee, leaving her husband locked in the room. But at that precise moment, she witnessed a scene that shook her heart to its foundations. And from that day on, her life took a completely new direction. Are you going through a moment of despair? Do you feel like there's no hope left? If so, I ask you to listen carefully to this story. Perhaps in it, you will find a fragment of yourself you thought was lost. I remember that day with absolute clarity. The day I, dressed in an immaculate white wedding gown, entered the unfamiliar house of a man I didn't love. It wasn't fate or love. I married to pay a debt. Although it seems incredible, at 25, my life no longer belonged to me. My father had passed away a long time ago, and due to a scam perpetrated by a relative, the only thing left for my mother and me was a debt of almost. My mother alone barely managed to subsist by selling vegetables at a market stall. Some days inspectors would chase her away, and she would return home empty-handed. My salary as an office clerk barely covered my expenses and my mother's medicine. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. There was no way to bear the weight of the debt that was crushing us. Then, one day, I received a marriage proposal from a man in a wheelchair. His name was Matthew, and he was the only son of Mr. Blackwood, the wealthiest man in the region. Matthew had been a promising young talent. He had studied abroad and was running his own business. But a few years earlier, a car accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. Even his family treated him as if he didn't exist. But his father, Mr. Blackwood, wanted to maintain appearances. He wanted to throw a lavish wedding to show that his son was still capable. He chose me because, although poor, I was a quiet, docile, and obedient woman. Mr. Blackwood proposed a deal to me. If I married Matthew, he would pay off my mother's entire debt, right after the ceremony. Furthermore, he assured me that I wouldn't have to fulfill my duties as a real wife. I only had to remain by Matthew's side, pretend to be his wife, and protect the family's image. I couldn't respond immediately. Upon returning home, I spent 3 days and 3 nights awake. The image of my mother kneeling, begging creditors, and the threatening messages saying they would destroy our house made me realize I had no escape. If I didn't take on this burden, my mother could collapse from the pressure. The debt would only breed more debt, and our lives would never escape this vicious circle. I accepted. The wedding took place 3 weeks later. A lavish ceremony at the most luxurious hotel, a convoy of high-end cars. But I, the bride, felt as if I were attending my own funeral. People whispered, "How lucky that girl is, marrying into a millionaire family." Others scoffed. "Lucky for what? They say the husband is in a wheelchair. It's obvious she married for money." I didn't reply to anything. I just smiled. Yes, it was true. I had married for money. The bridal suite was full of white flowers, a red velvet bed, and the scent of expensive French perfume. But my heart, reflected in the mirror, ached as if someone were scratching it. Matthew sat in silence. His deep, cold gaze showed not the slightest hesitation. He only said one sentence. "You don't need to pretend. I know you don't want to be here." I looked away. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or sad, but an idea began to germinate in my mind. If they've already given me the money and the debt is paid off, what reason do I have to stay here? That night, when the whole house was asleep, I quietly got up and packed some clothes in a suitcase. As I headed for the door, I hesitated for an instant. For some reason, I turned to look at him again. Matthew was still sitting with his eyes closed. I knew he wasn't sleeping, but he didn't stop me. I left feeling as light as if an immense weight had been lifted off me. However, upon reaching the main door, I remembered the receipt for my mother's debt payment. I needed proof that they had paid the money. I returned to the house. Everything was silent, and the bedroom door was ajar. The moment I entered, I froze. Matthew was trying to walk, not with his legs, but with his arms. He was clinging to the wall, dragging his body desperately as if his whole life was at stake in every inch he advanced. His body was soaked in sweat, his lips tightly pressed, and the veins on his forehead marked by the effort. Blood was oozing from the wounds on his elbows. I don't know how long I stood there. I only know that in that instant, something inside me collapsed. It wasn't out of compassion, it was because I felt terribly miserable and small. That man was not the weak person I'd imagined. I left the room as if fleeing, but this time it wasn't because I wanted to escape the place. It was because I was afraid of myself. I curled up on the backyard stairs, still tightly clinging to the handle of the suitcase, as if it were my last life raft. As the night progressed, the cold wind seeped through my clothes, but it was nothing compared to the cold I felt in my soul. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Something in my heart had broken. It wasn't love. I didn't have the capacity to love at that moment. It was that small glimpse of humanity, that bit of pride I thought I'd preserved until the end. I had tried to flee this contract marriage, my paraplegic husband, everything I considered a tragedy, but seeing Matthew alone in the deep night practicing to walk, I realized how terrifyingly small and selfish I was. I didn't understand why he was trying so hard. We hadn't exchanged a single word about our future. He himself had told me that he didn't need me to act like a real wife, that only appearances mattered. However, the image of his body soaked in sweat, dragging his immobile legs with difficulty while clinging to the wall, left me in shock. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but he was trying to prove it to himself, and I, on the other hand, had tried to take the easy way out, to run away. The sound of a door opening behind me startled me. It was Matthew. I don't know how he had gotten there. Perhaps he had heard me. He was sitting in his wheelchair with a blanket over his legs. "You haven't left yet." I didn't answer. I just turned. "If you want to leave, go, but never come back." His voice held no anger, just the same frigidity of a frosty night. I bit my lip. Suddenly, I felt a bitter lump in my throat. "I came back for the receipt for my mother's debt payment." Matthew nodded, turned his chair, entered the house, and returned with a small envelope. "Here it is, with the president's seal and signature. There is nothing left to tie you to this place." He held out the envelope to me with a firm hand. His gaze was cruelly serene. I took it and stood still for a moment. Something didn't feel right. With the receipt in hand, everything should have been over, right? Then why did my heart feel so heavy? "Why are you practicing to walk?" The words left my mouth without me being able to control them. My voice trembled. "You don't have to do this." Matthew was silent for an instant and then replied in a voice as low as a whisper, "Because I don't want to be a burden to anyone, and because I want to live like a person." I looked at him for the first time. I looked at him for real. His deep eyes were no longer cold like on our wedding day. Instead, there was a now familiar pain and a strength that inspired respect. "Do you hate me a lot?" I asked. He didn't answer dryly, but I felt disappointed. His response oppressed my heart. Sometimes indifference hurts more than hatred. I squeezed the envelope. As someone who has closed a deal, I should turn around and leave. But my feet wouldn't move. Matthew was no longer looking at me. He turned his chair to go back inside. It was then that I urgently called him. "Matthew, could you give me a few more days? I don't want to leave tonight. It's not out of fear, it's because I've started to want to know you better." I lowered my head. "I have a debt to you that I must pay. The debt of seeing you as you deserve." Matthew didn't respond, but drove his wheelchair toward the bedroom and didn't lock the door. Perhaps it was silent permission, or perhaps he was too tired to argue with me anymore. Shortly after, I entered the room. It no longer felt like a prison confining me. Strangely, it felt calm. Matthew was lying on his back facing the wall. I lay down on the adjacent bed. We were two strangers in silence, but bound by the same destiny. I didn't sleep at all that night. The image of Matthew crawling on the floor inch by inch, the desperate look in his eyes, full of a yearning to live, did not leave my mind. I truly wonder if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to be quiet to maintain peace, or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion because every story is like a candle that can light the way for someone else. The next morning I got up early. Surprisingly, Matthew was already awake. He was next to the table using his arms to pour himself a glass of warm milk. "Aren't you calling the assistant? They don't have the obligation to do everything for me," he replied, "but you could fall." If I fall, I'll get up, he responded indifferently. I approached, helping. Let me help you. Matthew looked at me. His gaze was different from last night, a little softer, but still with a tinge of caution. He nodded and slid the glass of milk toward me. From that day on, I stayed in that house, not out of obligation, but out of my own decision. I helped Matthew with small tasks. We had breakfast together and exchanged a few unimportant sentences. He never asked why I stayed, and I never gave explanations. Everything flowed in silence like smoke, but inside, a multitude of emotions stirred silently. I began to realize that Matthew wasn't simply a man with a disability. He was someone who had risen from adversity, tasted success, and been knocked down by fate. The accident had taken his legs, but not his pride. And for the first time in my life, I understood that some people, even sitting in a wheelchair, can stand taller in the hearts of others. And I, although physically intact, sometimes live below my own limitations. I didn't know how much longer I would stay there, but I knew that this marriage wasn't the worst of the sentences from which I should immediately flee. If I left now, I would not only abandon Matthew, but also that most human part of me that had just begun to wake up. 3 days had passed since the night I tried to flee. No one mentioned what had happened. No one spoke of the envelope containing the receipt that my mother's debt had been paid off. But even though no one said anything, I knew that a silent, unmentionable distance still existed between Matthew and me. We lived like roommates, courteous and kind, but not close. In the morning, I prepared milk for Matthew, helped him move from the bed to the wheelchair, accompanied him to the dining room, and then tidied his room. Throughout the day, we barely exchanged more than 5 or 6 sentences, but strangely, in that silence, my heart began to be moved little by little. I started to notice the small details, that Matthew had the habit of reading at night, holding the book with his left hand while drumming with the pencil in his right, that he didn't like overly liquid purees, even though the assistant often prepared them thinking they would be easier for a paralyzed patient to swallow. After eating, he always cleaned his mouth himself and meticulously folded the napkin. No matter how tired he was, he didn't want anyone to do those things for him. Strangely, I felt attracted to those very ordinary gestures. I'd always thought that a person with a disability needed compassion, but the more I lived with Matthew, the more I realized that he needed neither compassion nor empathy. What he wanted was respect, to be fully recognized as a man, even if his 2 legs had lost their strength. One morning while I was cleaning the table, Matthew suddenly asked, "How long do you plan to stay here?" I paused for a moment. Before I could answer, he continued, "I'm not asking to kick you out. It's just that I don't know whether I should wish for you to leave or to stay." I looked up and met his eyes directly. I didn't avoid it. "I don't know either, but right now I don't want to leave." Matthew was silent. After a moment, he nodded. "Then stay. But if you stay out of pity, forget it. I don't need that." Instead of getting angry, his words hurt me. It hurt that he thought I could feel sorry for him, and it hurt to think that perhaps he was right. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. I thought of my mother, who would now live peacefully, free of debt. She had called me the previous afternoon with a voice that mixed joy and worry. "Honey, they say your new family is very rich, but be careful. You never know what people's intentions might be." I couldn't say anything. I couldn't confess to her that her own daughter had planned a betrayal on her first wedding night. I hung up the phone with a lump in my throat. I wanted to make it up to him, but how do you mend an invisible wound you've inflicted on another person's heart? The next morning, while I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, the assistant rushed over and whispered, "Ma'am, Mr. Matthews' aunt is here. Be careful. She has a difficult temperament." I nodded without giving it much importance, but when I went out to the living room and saw a woman dressed in an elegant black suit, her arms laden with gold bracelets, looking me up and down, I understood her warning was real. "Well, so you're Matthew's wife?" she asked mockingly. "Yes, Aunt. Good morning. My name is Sophia." You're pretty, but I heard you come from a very poor family. Is there anything your family can boast about? What did you do?" I smiled kindly. "Yes, my mother sells vegetables at the market, and I worked as an administrator in a pharmaceutical company." She burst out laughing. Her voice was full of contempt. "Wow, this family is generous. Hiring you must have just been to keep up appearances. You should be grateful they bought you for so much money, don't you think?" I raised my head. The smile did not disappear from my lips. You're right, Aunt. There was a time when I thought I wasn't up to par, but I haven't come here to strike it rich. I just want to fulfill my role as a wife. Even if I'm not loved, at least I deserve to live with dignity. The aunt was speechless for a moment. Before she could react, Matthew came out of the adjacent room in his wheelchair. Aunt, that's enough. In this house, I will not tolerate anyone insulting my wife. Pale, she turned to Matthew. What? Are you taking her side? For a girl bought with debt, whoever she is, you have no right to treat her that way. Matthew's voice was firm. I froze. It was the first time anyone had defended me in front of others, not for honor or love, simply because I was his wife. The aunt left, unable to contain her anger. Matthew turned to me. His gaze was serene like a sunset. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I shook my head. Don't worry, I'm actually used to it. But you shouldn't get used to being hurt. No one deserves to hear those words, Sophia. I turned my head. I felt as if someone had gently grasped my heart. It didn't hurt, but it was a very firm grip. That night, when I returned to the room and got into bed, Matthew was the first to speak. Sophia, thank you for not leaving. I bit my lip. After a moment, I replied softly, and thank you for not hating me, Matthew. Matthew didn't answer, but I could feel that his breathing had become calmer, as if something inside his heart had also begun to softly melt. After the small confrontation with his aunt, I thought the relationship with Matthew would soften a bit. At least we no longer treated each other like strangers living under the same roof. But just when everything was starting to feel a little more comfortable, an unexpected event silently approached. It was as light as a passing breeze, but in its wake, it swept away even the peace that was barely beginning to blossom. It was a Saturday morning. I was hanging clothes in the backyard when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I thought it might be an acquaintance of my mother or a former coworker, so I answered, "Hello, this is Sophia." A man's voice, low, husky, and chillingly familiar, came from the other side. Sophia, it's me. I froze on the spot. How many years had passed? That voice couldn't be. Daniel? Yes, it's me. I just arrived in New York. I've been looking for you. My body was paralyzed, and my hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the phone. It was him, the man I had loved madly, whom I had waited for 3 years only to find a miserable ending. The man who had disappeared without a word, leaving me immersed in pain and betrayal. How did you get my number? I asked with a dry throat. I asked your mother. I know you're married, but I wanted to see you just once, really just once. I'm in front of your house. As if I had received an electric shock, I ran to the main door without thinking. And indeed, he was there, still tall and slender, with the same look that had once melted my heart. But I was no longer the 22-year-old dreamer. I was the wife of a man. Even if it was a contract marriage, I couldn't allow myself a betrayal. You shouldn't have come here, I said, with a firmness that surprised myself. Daniel lowered his head. With his hands in his pockets, he seemed very uneasy. I'm sorry, I left without saying anything. I really didn't have another option. My parents' business went bankrupt. I went to Los Angeles to work in construction and had an accident. When I woke up, I had lost all my contacts. I stood there feeling my heart pound hard. Hatred, pain, and fragments of broken memories suddenly invaded me. I'm married. You shouldn't be here. But are you happy? Daniel asked pleadingly. Happy? I was about to say yes, but my lips didn't move. I'm happy. Matthew and I had never loved each other. I tried to run away. Our relationship is still something ambiguous, unnamed. Please leave me alone. I owe too much to one person. I don't want to do anything that could hurt him. Daniel didn't say anything else. He looked at me for a long time and then turned around with heavy steps, as if carrying all the sadness in the world. I returned home with my heart in turmoil. As I entered, I saw Matthew sitting in the living room. His gaze was fixed on the door, as if he had been sitting there for a long time. Who was that? His voice was as thin as a thread, but it made my heart skip a beat. I swallowed. An old acquaintance. Old love? He asked bluntly. I nodded. With someone like Matthew, lies didn't work. He wasn't someone who could be easily deceived. Do you plan to go back with him? He asked. His gaze was no longer as serene as before. No, I don't love him anymore. It was just a moment of weakness for the past. Matthew didn't say anything else and turned his head to look out the window. I know you don't owe me anything. We never had any ties. I didn't interrupt him. My decision to stay here is mine. No one has forced me, whether it's to return a favor or for any other reason. I don't want to hurt anyone. Matthew remained silent, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was light, like a sigh of relief. That night, I was on the balcony looking at the moon. Matthew approached quietly in his wheelchair. He stood by my side, looking at the moon with me without saying anything. After a while, he suddenly said, "You know, Sophia, since I became paralyzed in all these years, no one had truly chosen to stay by my side. My former fiancé left me, my friends distanced themselves, even my relatives avoided me. I thought you would do the same." I looked at him slowly. I was about to, but now I know that staying is the right thing to do. He smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile since we got married. A genuine smile, neither cynical nor sad. At that moment, I felt my heart skip a beat, not from pain, but from emotion. Perhaps I had begun to love this man in a wheelchair, not because he had paid my mother's debt, but because he himself had taught me what true courage is, how to live without depending on compassion, and how to stand tall even when you can't stand on your feet. Tell me whether you have parents, grandparents, or older family members who deserve more respect than they currently receive from their families. Alternatively, tell me if you yourself are going through a situation in which you're not appreciated as much as you truly deserve. But just when I thought everything was getting better, a week later another secret came to light, and this time it didn't come from me but from his family. One afternoon while I was preparing dinner, the assistant whispered to me, "Ma'am, I think Mr. Blackwood is trying to sell the house behind the young master's back to pay off a personal debt. I heard them talking in the basement." I froze, selling the house to pay off a personal debt. What was happening? And why hide it from Matthew? That afternoon, I was so agitated that I almost dropped the vegetables I was washing. The assistant's whisper was pricking me inside like a needle. Selling the house to pay off a personal debt. And secretly from Matthew. Why? And why was I, a stranger, the first to know? I hurriedly dried my hands and returned to the kitchen as if nothing had happened, but my mind was in chaos. If what the assistant said was true, Matthew knew nothing. He is the only son, wounded in body and soul, and his father, the man I thought loved his son, was he really like that? I didn't dare ask Matthew, but that night, after making sure he was asleep, I quietly left the room and went downstairs. In Mr. Blackwood's house, there was a locked basement behind the service kitchen. Since I arrived, I had never seen anyone go in there. Only once, on the wedding day, I heard Mr. Blackwood discussing something in a very low voice with an unknown man. I approached carefully, just as the assistant said. A faint yellow light filtered through the crack in the wooden door. I put my ear to it and listened. "I told you, we can get at least $8 million for those coastal lands, 3 for the bank debt, and the rest we'll split among the 3 of us. No one in the family is to know, including Matthew, but if Matthew finds out, he'll object immediately. And what does he know? He's nothing but a useless invalid who lives thanks to me. What right does he have to object?" Upon hearing those words, my blood boiled. I clenched my fists and my whole body trembled. Every word from Mr. Blackwood was like a blade piercing my heart. It wasn't about the money, it was about his cold and ruthless attitude. The man who had paid my mother's debt, whom I considered honorable and moral, was actually deceiving his son to pay his personal debts and enrich himself. What hurt me the most was that he didn't see Matthew as a person with feelings, but as a burden he could use and exclude from all decisions. I turned around, clutching in my chest to be able to breathe. My steps down the dark hallway were as heavy as lead. I couldn't sleep that night. Only one question revolved in my head. Does Matthew know? The next morning, I decided to tell him everything. I didn't want to hide it from him. But before speaking, I asked him, "Matthew, do you think people are capable of sacrificing even their own blood to save their honor?" Matthew thought for a moment and then shook his head. "No one should, but for some people, appearances are more important than family." I nodded and started to speak slowly. "Your father is trying to sell the coastal lands, not for you, but to pay off a personal debt, and he's trying to hide it from you." Matthew froze. He didn't react with the anger or vehemence I expected. His face simply hardened, as if all energy had abandoned him. After a moment, he asked, "Are you sure?" I heard it with my own ears in the basement. He nodded and silently rolled away in his wheelchair. I didn't follow him. I knew no one could calm the storm that breaks out in another person's heart. 3 days later, Matthew never mentioned the matter again, but I knew he was quietly verifying the facts. He secretly reviewed property documents and called his father's acquaintances, and his gaze grew darker every day. There was no longer any light in it. It was the look of someone who knows he has been betrayed but cannot resist. That night he told me, "The receipt for the my father gave you, do you still have it?" "Yes, I still have it." "Don't throw it away. A day will come when you'll need it." He spoke as if he were leaving a will. I looked at him confused. "Do you have a plan?" "There is one more person who can save this house." "Who?" "You." I was stunned. "What can I do?" "You are my legal wife. There are properties that my father didn't have time to change after the wedding, and they are in both our names as community property. If you don't give your consent, he won't be able to sell those lands at his whim." I was speechless. "But if I do that, your father will hate me. I could be rejected by the entire family." Matthew looked at me with eyes as sad as an autumn lake. "You don't owe them anything, but if you want to save me, this time you'll have to stand by my side like a real wife." I was silent, not out of fear, but because for the first time I felt that Matthew needed me, not for formality or for a deal. He was a man asking for protection from the only woman left by his side. I accepted. "I'll do it." The next morning, I contacted a lawyer friend, a former coworker. I asked him to draft a document to assert my rights over the community property, and at the same time, I filed a request with the land registry to paralyze any transaction on those properties until there was a marital agreement. In the afternoon, Mr. Blackwood received the notification. He summoned me to the living room. His eyes were bloodshot like those of a wounded beast. "What the hell have you done, Sophia? You're a stranger. By what right do you interfere in this family's affairs?" I stood firm without backing down. "I am Matthew's legal wife. As a member of this family, I also have my rights. If you intended to sell the lands, you should have at least informed Matthew. And if you think that because he's in a wheelchair, he has no rights, then you are wrong, sir." He pounded the desk with his fist. His face turned red. "And you think you've done the right thing?" "Ingrate." I looked him directly in the eyes without flinching. "I also tried to flee, but it was Matthew who made me stay, and now I cannot allow him to be hurt again. Even if I earn your hatred for it, I won't regret it." Mr. Blackwood didn't say anything else, but I knew he had just lost an important card, and I, for the first time, felt like a man's true wife, not because of a marriage certificate, but because I had dared to fight with him against the injustice of his own family. After that confrontation, the air in the house became dense and heavy, as if a thick fog had invaded it. Mr. Blackwood no longer shouted, but his silence was more chilling. He didn't need to raise his voice to express his fury. He used icy glares, contemptuous treatment, and words loaded with meaning to slowly pressure me. That night at dinner, it was just Matthew, Mr. Blackwood, and me. He barely tasted a bite before getting up and leaving in silence. Matthew looked at me and shook his head. "Don't mind him. For my father, honor is more important than family. When money is involved, he doesn't see anyone as a relative." I didn't reply, but deep down in my heart, I knew he had started to see me as a thorn he had to pluck out, and his revenge came much sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I went grocery shopping as usual. Upon returning, the assistant rushed out to meet me, agitated. "Ma'am, something terrible has happened." The president brought some men, and they searched Mr. Matthews' entire room. They forced the lock and took the deeds, the bank books, and even his medical reports. I ran to the room, terrified. Matthew's study was a chaos. The shelves were overturned, the drawers open, everything messed up as if a hurricane had passed through there. Matthew sat, motionless. His face was pale and cold as paper. His fists were so clenched that his nails dug into his palms, making them bleed. I approached and asked in a low voice, "Are you okay?" "He just wants to make it clear that this house is his," Matthew said, "and that I'm just a hanger-on. And you, an unwelcome daughter-in-law." I suppressed my anger and swallowed. "I'll talk to your father again." "You don't have to," Matthew interrupted me. "You've done enough. Now it's my turn." That afternoon, Matthew called his personal lawyer. He asked him to prepare a civil lawsuit for the co-ownership of the community property, arguing that he had never signed a waiver of his assets and that our marriage was valid. I sat by his side without saying anything. I simply remained silent behind him. I knew that if I added a single word more, Matthew would feel even weaker. Exactly 3 days later, Mr. Blackwood received the court summons. This time, his anger could no longer be contained. He summoned us to the living room in front of the assistant and two curious relatives and shouted, "After all these years raising you, now you dare to sue your own father, Matthew." Matthew calmly replied, "Father, you have no right to dispose of the community property without my consent. The law states so. The law feeds you. I am the one who supports you, and now you bite the hand that feeds you." I took a step forward. "Sir, it's not fair for you to talk like that. If we've offended you, we are sorry. But we don't want a war. We just want to protect the minimum of justice and trust left in this family." Mr. Blackwood waved his hand. "Shut up! You are not in a position to give lessons in this house. The mouse we brought in for convenience now intends to destroy the family." His words left me frozen. I had never felt so humiliated. But what hurt me the most was Matthew's gaze. This time, he didn't defend me like the last time. He simply lowered his head and remained silent. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, I sat alone on the balcony. For the first time since I decided to stay, I felt completely empty. I wasn't angry with Mr. Blackwood. He had always been like that. I was sad about Matthew's chance. Perhaps he was also under too much pressure, or perhaps he had started to suspect that I had dragged him into the war against his father. An hour passed. Matthew quietly approached in his wheelchair and sat next to me. Silence reigned between us. Finally, he broke the ice. "I'm sorry I stayed silent earlier." I didn't answer. "I didn't want to put you in danger. If I had said something, my father would have been even more convinced that you were inciting me. I was afraid he would hurt you." I turned to him. His emaciated face was filled with an apologetic look. I felt tears escape, not out of sadness, but because I understood him. "You don't need to defend me. I just need to know that you are still on my side." He gently took my hand. "I will always be on your side, no matter what." I nodded, and at that precise moment, I realized that I loved this man. I loved his calm, his strength, and that small heart that, even in the midst of deep pain, thought of me, but the storm was not over yet. The next morning, the police showed up at the house. They handed me a summons. An anonymous complaint had been filed, accusing me of fraudulent marriage to appropriate my husband's assets. My body was paralyzed. Matthew's face turned livid with anger. He tried to sit up and shouted, "I know perfectly well who has done this. Do I need to say his name out loud?" Everyone present fell silent. Mr. Blackwood continued to drink his tea without saying anything. He neither denied nor refuted it, but his gaze was enough to know that this was his true revenge. That morning, the already frosty atmosphere of the house became darker than ever. The sound of the police car at the door made the assistant almost drop the teapot she was serving. I stood still. The officer with a dry voice handed me the summons. It didn't seem serious, but it was intimidating enough. "Mrs. Sophia Adams, you must appear to testify in relation to a complaint of alleged fraudulent marriage for the purpose of appropriating assets. Report tomorrow at 8 a.m. to the precinct." I received the paper with both hands. The red seal on it looked like a wound. I knew who had orchestrated all this. It could be none other than Mr. Blackwood. His indifferent attitude while drinking tea, as if he had nothing to do with it, was the clearest proof. I looked at Matthew. His face was flushed with anger, and his hands, gripping the armrests of the chair, trembled slightly. "I'll go with you, Sophia," Matthew said firmly. "No, I'm fine." I gently squeezed his shoulder. "I'll go alone. If I haven't done anything wrong, I have nothing to fear." Matthew looked at me with worried eyes, but finally nodded. He still wouldn't let go of my hand. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. I remembered every day I had lived in that house. From the wedding day, the moment I tried to run away, to the night I saw him crawl with his arms. All the moments when I chose to stay and decided to face everything with him passed through my mind like a slow-motion movie. I, who once considered myself just an actress playing the role of a wife, was now at the center of the storm of a wealthy family, but one full of intrigues. I didn't regret staying, but for the first time I wondered if I hadn't gone too far. The next morning, I put on a white shirt, neatly tied my hair back, and without makeup, headed to the police precinct. I wanted people to see me as I really was, not as a fake daughter-in-law or a scammer, but as a woman with dignity who stood by her husband, willing to overcome everything. An inspector led me to a small interrogation room. There were two people, the inspector in charge, and a woman who looked like a legal advisor. Mrs. Sophia Adams, an anonymous complaint has been received. The content alleges that you married your husband taking advantage of his disability to appropriate family assets. Do you have anything to say about this? I took a deep breath and raised my head. I married Mr. Matthew Blackwood with the full consent of both parties, and we formalized a legally valid marriage. If necessary, I can present my mother's medical reports, the receipt that my in-laws paid off a debt, and the debt settlement document signed by Mr. Blackwood, whom I presume is the one who denounced me. However, there is testimony that during your cohabitation with your husband, you maintained an inappropriate relationship with another man. My heart skipped a beat. It seemed they also knew about Daniel's visit. I calmly replied, "It is true that a former boyfriend came looking for me, but I did not resume any relationship with him. He came to apologize for the past, and that was the end of it. If necessary, they can review the security cameras at my house. They can prove that he wasn't there for more than 5 minutes." The inspector stared at me for a long time and then nodded. The woman next to him wrote something in her papers. After a moment, the inspector added, "For the confrontation, we will also summon Mr. Blackwood Sr. and your husband. Until the investigation is complete, you cannot leave your place of residence without authorization." I nodded and left the precinct. My mind was a whirlwind. It wasn't the investigation that scared me. I was worried about what Matthew would think of all this. Upon arriving home, Matthew was waiting for me at the door. He was sitting in his wheelchair in the sun without a hat, his forehead beaded with sweat. "Are you okay?" he asked worriedly. I shook my head and sat beside him. With one hand, I wiped the sweat from his forehead, and with the other, I squeezed his. "I'm fine, but your father won't stop here." Matthew squeezed my hand tightly. "Then we'll have to be stronger." That night, for the first time since we got married, Matthew called me into his study. He handed me a sheaf of documents. "This is a list of all the properties in my name. You keep it so you know what to do if something happens to me." I looked at my husband with a lump in my throat. I didn't want his things. I didn't want to become the person everyone said I was, a fortune hunter. But for the first time, I felt that he fully trusted me. I nodded and took the documents. "I promise you, I will protect what you value so much." 2 days later, the confrontation took place at the precinct. Matthew, Mr. Blackwood, and I attended. As soon as we entered the room, Mr. Blackwood glared at me, but I didn't lower my head. I was no longer the woman who was easily scared. The inspector asked Mr. Blackwood, "Mr. Blackwood, is it true that you personally paid off a debt of your daughter-in-law's mother right after your son's wedding?" Mr. Blackwood hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "That's right, it was to maintain the family's appearances, but that woman married my son only to get that money. After the wedding, she didn't take care of him as a wife should." The inspector turned to Matthew. "Mr. Blackwood, son, what is your opinion?" Matthew took a deep breath and said in a clear, firm voice, "Sophia is my legal wife. She tried to leave but chose to stay again, not for money, but for me. She has taken care of me and even protected me from the unjust pressure of my own family. If someone says she married me for interest, that person should first look at themselves and ask who is using others to cover up their own flaws." The room fell silent. Only the sound of a pen writing on paper could be heard. At that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. I will never forget that day. The moment when Matthew, in the precinct interrogation room, in front of 3 police officers and his own father, declared, "If I have to choose between the family's honor and the truth, I choose the truth, because the only thing that can protect a person's heart is the truth." His words resonated like a bell in the tense atmosphere. Mr. Blackwood didn't react immediately. I only saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the armrests of the chair, but I knew it wasn't out of emotion, but out of extreme fury. From that day on, the atmosphere in the house went from tension to darkness. Mr. Blackwood no longer shouted or dropped hints. He chose absolute silence, a dangerous silence. And 3 days later, the last card he had been hiding for so long came to light. It was Sunday morning. As I was preparing breakfast, the doorbell rang. At the door was an unknown woman. She was elegantly dressed, wearing sunglasses, and holding the hand of a boy about 5 or 6 years old. "Excuse me, is this Mr. Blackwood's residence?" I was a little surprised, but replied courteously, "Yes, it is. Come in." She scrutinized me from head to toe and then said bluntly, "I am the mother of your husband, Matthew Blackwood's son." I froze. My heart seemed to stop for a few seconds. "Pardon, what did you say?" I stammered with a dry throat. "What you heard. This boy is your husband, Matthew's son. I am his mother. If you don't believe me, call him and check for yourself." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Matthew had a son. If it was true, why had he never told me? While I remained petrified, Matthew came out of his room in his wheelchair. Upon seeing the woman, he paused for an instant, but he didn't seem surprised or nervous. On the contrary, he was so calm that it was chilling. "Why did you bring the child?" Matthew asked. The woman took off her sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes and well-defined eyebrows. "Because I will not allow my son to lose his inheritance rights. The rumor is that you are soon going to transfer your share to your wife. I came to remind you that you have another son." The air became suffocating. I grabbed the arm of a chair so as not to fall. Matthew turned to me and said slowly, "Sophia, I'm sorry I didn't tell you before, but I don't have any children with this woman. It was all a setup by my father before the accident." The woman scoffed. "Now you're backing out? Did you think I would stay silent?" "I was supposed to keep it a secret, but Mr. Blackwood asked me to hint it to you. He told me that if I opened my mouth, your position as wife would disappear in an instant." I looked at Matthew, searching his eyes for an explanation, sincerity, or at least a simple acknowledgement. Matthew nodded. His gaze fixed on me did not waver. "Before the accident, I had a complicated relationship. I didn't love her. It was a marriage of convenience for papers that my father arranged for a business collaboration. I was forced. After the accident, I wanted to annul everything, but my father wouldn't allow it." I was speechless. "So that child is not your son?" "We did DNA tests a long time ago," Matthew said firmly, "but my father hid the results. He was afraid they would stain the family's reputation, and now he's using this to get you out of my life." The woman hesitated. She didn't expect Matthew to dare to mention the DNA tests. After a moment, she shouted, "Fayahan, is that what we're going with? Well, get ready. I will sue you for affiliation." "Sue me, but first, it would be advisable for you to request a new DNA test because I keep the original results in a safe, along with the proof that you received money to give false testimony." Matthew's gaze did not falter for an instant. The woman's face turned livid with anger. She turned sharply, pulled the child's hand toward the door, and didn't forget to launch a final threat. "Mr. Blackwood will not leave you alone." Even after the door slammed shut, I remained paralyzed in the chair. My emotions were a chaos: surprise, anger, confusion, and pain. Matthew approached in his chair and sat in front of me. He took my hand, which was ice cold. "Sophia, I'm sorry. I didn't know my father would go to these extremes. I was going to tell you everything when this was over. It's my fault. I shouldn't have hidden it." I pulled his hand away. Tears blurred my vision. I'm not blaming you. I'm just tired. I really am very tired. Why does everything have to be so complicated? I guess because I was born into a family that doesn't know what affection is. Matthew's words left me breathless. The man who had lost his legs and his faith in love was now reduced to a commercial tool by his own father, and had to endure that cruel revenge with his own body. I looked at him. My heart ached as if it were being cut with a knife. But for the first time in my life, I wanted to do something for him. Not out of gratitude or for a debt, but because I truly loved him. I wiped away my tears and said with a trembling voice, "You don't have to apologize. We'll get through this together. I won't let anyone expel you from this world, as if you were a broken object." Matthew bit his lip. His eyes turned red. He didn't cry. But I knew that if he could have gotten up, he would have hugged me with all his might. And the next day, Matthew published the DNA test results on his social media with a strong statement. "I currently have no children from any marital relationship. Legal action will be taken against any falsehood." The publication caused a great uproar, Relatives, neighbors, and business partners began to whisper, and Mr. Blackwood's prestige officially fell to the ground. But I knew that would only make him an even more dangerous person. From the day Matthew published the DNA test results, this mansion ceased to be a warm home. It became a luxurious cage, but one full of tension and coldness. Everyone in the house walked in silence, spoke in low voices, and avoided looking each other in the eye as if fearing a bomb about to explode. But we all knew that the inevitable was coming, and it arrived sooner than expected. A week later, on a Sunday morning, while Matthew and I were preparing breakfast, Mr. Blackwood came down from his room. There was no longer any anger on his face. Instead, there was a mixture of coldness and a sense of triumph, like someone who has found the last card to win the game. "This afternoon at 6, everyone in the living room. The Blackwood family has an announcement to make." He spoke briefly and turned around without allowing time for questions. I looked at Matthew. He frowned, but didn't say anything. There was no longer any fear in his eyes, and instead there was the calm of someone who anticipates and prepares for a major event. That afternoon, at the agreed-upon time, all the Blackwood family relatives gathered. The spacious and luxurious living room had become a solemn boardroom. The chairs were arranged in order, and everyone had serious expressions. On the main table, instead of the usual tea and pastries, there was a thick envelope with a red seal, and next to it, a laptop prepared to project a document. Mr. Blackwood sat in the center with his personal lawyer, an older man in a gray suit on his left, and to his right, a young secretary with a frosty expression. Matthew entered in his wheelchair, and I followed him. All eyes were fixed on us, half compassion, half curiosity. "I have convened everyone today because there is an important matter to discuss," said Mr. Blackwood. His voice was clear. "It is about a change in my will." A murmur ran through the room. I tightly squeezed Matthew's hand. He maintained his composure, but I felt a slight tremor in his arm. Mr. Blackwood motioned to the secretary. She opened the laptop and projected the new will onto the large television screen. "According to this will, all my real estate assets, that is, 3 residences and prime land in the city center, as well as all my shares in the company, will be inherited by my nephew, Charles Blackwood. My son, Matthew Blackwood, will inherit nothing except for a monthly allowance for his expenses. The total control of the assets will be administered by Charles on my behalf from the day of my death." A suffocating silence took hold of the room. All eyes, filled with astonishment, turned to Mr. Blackwood, but he, as if nothing had happened, slowly drank his tea as if telling a trivial story. I was stunned. Matthew, the legitimate heir, had been excluded from all his rights in an instant, without warning, without an official reason, only with a phrase that sounded like alms, a monthly allowance of— I squeezed Matthew's hand, but he remained seated, staring at the screen. There was no longer any pain in his eyes. Instead, there was only coldness, a glacial coldness. The lawyer began to read the clauses one by one. I didn't hear anything. Only one sentence echoed in my head. "Given that his health status is not guaranteed, it is considered that Matthew Blackwood no longer has the capacity to administer the estate, so he is excluded from the list of heirs." Matthew laughed, a dry, bitter laugh. "So this is what you were preparing. What you wanted was to completely erase me from your life." Mr. Blackwood put down the teacup and nodded. "Correct. I cannot entrust the future of the family to someone who lives in a wheelchair depending on others. I need someone capable." "But I am your son," I shouted, unable to contain myself. "Even if his body is impaired, he is a person who thinks, who feels, who has morals. He has defended this family's honor for years. How can you do this?" "Shut up," shouted Mr. Blackwood, interrupting me for the first time in the entire meeting. "Who do you think you are to lecture me on how to be a father? The daughter-in-law I brought in to keep up appearances now intends to sermonize her elders." I felt a lump in my throat. Matthew placed his hand on mine, indicating that I should calm down. "So this is your final decision," Matthew said. "Yes, all the documents are notarized. Sue me if you want, I'm ready." Matthew was silent for a few seconds. Then, in a low, slow voice, he said, "I won't." I looked at him surprised, but Matthew looked back at me. There was determination in his eyes. "I don't need to sue. I don't want a fortune built without blood or tears. If to recover it, I have to sell my dignity, then I don't want it." but I will leave here forever." Mr. Blackwood jumped to his feet. "How dare you?" "And I will leave with Sophia. We don't need anything more than our peace of mind. If you have an ounce of conscience left, leave us alone. If you continue to bother us, I won't remain silent anymore either." The room fell into a dead silence. No one expected the man in the wheelchair to utter such forceful words. His legs might have lost their strength, but his mind and his will had never been broken. I squeezed his hand tightly. At that moment, I understood that there is no greater wealth than oneself, and that it is not worth staying in a family where only calculations and interests remain. The next day, Matthew and I packed our bags in silence. No one said goodbye to us, no one stopped us. Only a note on the table. "I will not argue with you anymore, Father, but I will live as a human being, not as a shadow. Goodbye, Matthew." As we walked out the door of the mansion valued at millions, I turned around one last time. Everything there was luxurious and grand, but it was empty. We left with nothing more than each other. The silver taxi began to move slowly, pulling away from the luxurious neighborhood where I once arrived in a white wedding gown, full of calculations, fears, and promises to myself. Now I left in silence, untethered, without fortune, without status, but with a heart lighter than ever. Matthew, sitting next to me, held my hand tightly, as if afraid I would disappear. His face showed fatigue, but his eyes shone with a strange intensity. I knew he was hurt, rejected by his own father with a cruel will, the object of pity or scorn from his entire family. But at the same time, he was free to start over, on his own terms, without having to strive to please anyone. "Where are we going?" I asked softly as the taxi left the city. Matthew looked at me and smiled. "There's a small house in Vermont. My mother, may she rest in peace, left it. I've never been there, but I think it's time to go back." I nodded. I didn't need a grand mansion or luxury cars. A house with a roof and the man I had chosen as my husband by my side was enough. This time, out of a genuine feeling, not out of obligation or a debt. The house in Vermont was nestled on a hill surrounded by a pine forest and wildflowers. It wasn't big, barely 500 square feet. The red roof was faded by time, but the walls were sturdy and the door was firm, and the most special thing was that that house had a soul. I felt it from the moment I entered. It smelled musty, but it was warm. Matthew was speechless when he saw the old wooden desk his mother had used. In the faded tablecloth and the old photos hanging on the wall, his mother seemed to continue to embroider with patience and affection. I took his hand. "We will fix this house. I will decorate the kitchen and plant flowers. And you will write that book you dreamed of. How about that?" Matthew nodded. Dead. His eyes reddened. "Aren't you afraid of the difficulties?" I smiled with a mixture of sweetness and firmness. "I have lived suffocated by debts. I have peeled vegetables with my mother at the market and slept on the cold floor. I'm not afraid of difficulties. What I am afraid of is living alone without anyone to trust and to love." Matthew didn't say anything else. He pulled me toward him and rested his head on my shoulder. For the first time since I became his wife, I saw him truly vulnerable, not because he needed help, but because he trusted and leaned on me. The following days were busy but peaceful. I cleaned every corner of the house, washed the old blankets, and created a small vegetable patch in front of the house. Matthew, although in his wheelchair, did much more than I expected. He fixed the windows, changed the light bulbs, reorganized the old bookshelf, and began planning the writing of his autobiography. At first, not everything was easy. Without an assistant, I woke up at 5 a.m. to cook, do the laundry, and take Matthew out into the sun. The water pressure was low, the electricity was unstable, and on rainy days there were leaks. But strangely, I was happy because, for the first time, Matthew and I lived like a true marriage, sharing every task, every drop of sweat, and every laugh. One day, while I was preparing vegetables, I heard Matthew's voice behind me. "Sophia, come here for a moment." I turned and saw that he was holding a small, old wooden box. He opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring. It had no gems, but it shone in the sun. "I was saving this for when you decided to truly stay by my side," he said. "I want to give it to you now, not as a ring from a contract marriage, but as a ring of love." With a lump in my throat, I extended my hand and he put the ring on my ring finger. I also have something to say, I whispered. I started this marriage to save my mother, but I stayed for you, and now I don't need any reason to stay here. I just want to live by your side forever. Matthew's eyes filled with tears. Without saying anything, he rested his forehead against mine. The wind blowing through the pine trees sounded like a whisper of blessing. That night, I read the manuscript Matthew had just written. Every line was a fragment of his life. He wrote about the accident, about feeling like a decoration to his family, about the pain when his former fiancée abandoned him, and about our first wedding night, about the moment he saw me standing by the window with a suitcase in my hand and empty eyes. He wrote, I thought she would leave, and I didn't blame her, but when she came back, when she prepared my first glass of milk, I knew that perhaps life hadn't been so cruel to me after all. I closed the manuscript. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I had never imagined that I could be so important to someone. Just that night, a call from my lawyer friend startled me. Sophia, I don't know if I should tell you, but I just found out that Mr. Blackwood has been hospitalized for a stroke caused by stress. I squeezed the phone. I didn't know whether to be happy or sad. After all, he was my father-in-law, Matthew's father, the man who had mercilessly kicked us out of the house. But I looked at my side. Matthew was sleeping soundly after a hard day's work. I didn't want to wake him up. I didn't want anything to drag us back to the past. I hung up the phone. Perhaps we had left at the right time. Even though everything was burning behind us, we still had light ahead. 3 days had passed since the lawyer's call. I thought everything would be forgotten, like a page in a closed book. I didn't tell Matthew that his father had suffered a stroke. I thought it shouldn't matter to him anymore, but things weren't as simple as I thought. That morning, while I was hanging clothes in the yard, a package arrived for Matthew. The sender was the lawyer who had worked for his family for a long time. I dried my hands and went inside. I saw Matthew opening the envelope. His face was serious. Inside, next to a small USB drive, there was a brief handwritten note. Dear Matthew and Sophia, I know you don't wish to return to that house. However, the president recorded an audio file before his stroke. He asked me that if the day came when he couldn't speak, I should deliver it to you. The content is not long, but it is the story he wanted to confess in the end. I don't know what meaning this might have, but as a legal professional, I believe everyone has the right to be forgiven and understood, even if it is at the last moment. Sincerely, the lawyer. Matthew stared at the USB drive. I sat beside him and asked in a low voice, Do you want us to listen to it? He was silent for a long time and then nodded. I want to listen to it, not to forgive, but to understand. Perhaps after understanding, my heart will feel lighter. I brought him the laptop, and we connected the USB drive together. A single audio file appeared with the simple name, For My Son. I pressed the play button. Matthew, if you are listening to this, it means that your father is no longer in his right mind. Or perhaps it is that I didn't have the courage to tell you to your face. Mr. Blackwood's voice was heard. It wasn't firm as usual, but husky, slow, and exhausted. I've done many terrible things, I know, but for decades I lived believing I was doing the right thing. I was born into a family where honor was everything, where everything had to be grand, impressive, and meet the standards. They taught me that a man must be strong, the best, and never show weakness. But when you, my only son, were left paralyzed by an accident, I was afraid, not because I hated you, but because I was afraid people would laugh at me. I looked at Matthew. His lips were pressed tightly, and his gaze was fixed on the screen. I was afraid of losing appearances. I was terrified that people would ask me what my son was doing. I was terrified that relatives would whisper if I was going to leave the family business to an invalid. I let that fear eclipse even a father's love. A dry cough was heard on the recording, and then it continued as if he were emptying his soul. When you said in front of the whole family that you needed nothing more than peace of mind, I was in shock. For the first time, I realized that you were stronger than me. You stood tall on your dignity while I only held on to money and appearances. And Sophia, my daughter-in-law, I despised her. I thought she had married you for money, but when I saw her confront me, reject the estate, and leave with you without looking back, I knew she was the woman you deserved. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I didn't know if it was pain or emotion. Matthew, if you have the chance, I hope you forgive me, not because I deserve it, but because I don't want to die without having said a sincere word to my son." The recording ended there, without background music, without drama. Just a father who, at the last moment of his life, threw up the words he had repressed for a lifetime. Matthew remained seated in silence for a long time. Then he whispered, as if talking to himself, so he also knew he was wrong. I silently wrapped my hand around his. "It's okay." Matthew nodded. "I don't know what to call this feeling. It's not forgiveness, but my heart feels lighter, much lighter." We sat together in serene silence. The next afternoon, the lawyer called again. He said that Mr. Blackwood had regained consciousness, but that his ability to speak and move would be very limited. He wanted to see them once. It wasn't an obligation, but he had some final words to tell them in person. I handed the phone to Matthew. He listened in silence, neither objecting nor hesitating. That night, we returned to the mansion. Everything was still the same, but the feeling was completely different. I was no longer an outcast. I returned not to demand justice, but to close the last chapter of an old story that had been left unfinished. Mr. Blackwood lay in a hospital bed set up in the center of the living room. His face was emaciated, his hair whiter, and in his eyes there was no longer the flame of authority, only an immense emptiness. Upon seeing Matthew, his eyes filled with tears. Matthew approached the bed. Mr. Blackwood extended a trembling hand, but he couldn't speak, only agitated breathing and a pleading gaze. Matthew took his hand. He didn't say anything, but I knew that gesture was a response. The lawyer handed me an envelope. "It's the new will. The president changed the content after sending you the USB drive. The house in Vermont and a small amount of cash will be transferred to you immediately as compensation. The rest of the estate will be managed according to the original will." I didn't open the envelope. I looked at Matthew. He only said one thing. "If he has chosen to save appearances, at least let him go in peace." I nodded. We left when it was getting dark. There were no goodbyes, nor were they necessary. Matthew, looking at the mansion for the last time, said softly, "Father." I didn't know if Matthew had truly forgiven him, but I knew that day he had left the past behind without resentment. Since we left the mansion, everything changed, not because of the balance in our bank account or what the world calls wealth. It was because of a change in our hearts. We became lighter, deeper, and full of gratitude. The small house on the hill was no longer alone among the weeds. Matthew and I took care of it together day by day. We painted the walls white and put on new tiles. The front garden was filled with flowers, and the vegetable patch I planted grew next to the house. The small kitchen was always warm, filled with the smell of food and the sound of dishes. Sometimes happiness is as simple as that. Matthew published his book. I remember the day he held the first printed copy with trembling hands, like a child reaching a dream for the first time. The title was "I Sat Alone." It was an autobiography about his pain, betrayal, hope, and about a wife named Sophia. The book did not have a big promotion, but in 3 months, 3,000 copies were sold. Many readers sent him letters of thanks. Some said they were about to give up on life, but his story had given them a reason to continue. At night, he read those letters in silence and cried, not out of pride, but because he knew that Matthew had truly risen. His legs were still weak, but his soul was completely healed. A few months later, my body began to show strange signs: tiredness, nausea, lack of appetite, and a constant craving for sour things. Matthew thought it was due to overwork, and I attributed it to the weather. But when I went to the doctor smiled when he saw the ultrasound. "Congratulations, you're more than 6 weeks along." I froze. I had never dared to dream of becoming a mother. When I married Matthew, I had resigned myself to the idea that perhaps we wouldn't have children, partly because of his health condition and partly because I felt that fate had already taken too much from me to expect something so beautiful. So I left the consultation, and standing in the sun, squeezing the ultrasound, I cried like I never had before. That night, I prepared a simple dinner with Matthew's favorite dishes. Just as he finished eating, I took the ultrasound from my pocket and showed it to him in silence. "I have something for you." Matthew looked at the photo for a long time and then raised his head. His eyes were filled with tears. "Sophia, is this real?" I nodded. He didn't say anything else. He just reached across the table and squeezed my hand tightly. His hand was cold, but his heart was warm. That night, he wrote late. The next morning, I found a piece of paper on his desk. It was a letter to our baby. The first line said, "My dear son, perhaps Dad cannot teach you to run, but I will teach you never to collapse in the face of the most terrible things in the world." I read every line, unable to contain the tears. The man in the wheelchair was the strongest and tenderest person I knew. As my belly grew, Matthew also changed. He focused on his rehabilitation, practicing every morning, step by step, holding on to a wooden railing. Sometimes he would fall and hurt his forehead. When I ran to help him, he would smile and say, "Our baby will be born soon. I want to greet him standing." I rested my head on his shoulder without saying anything. I understood that there are loves that, without the need for grand words, make you cry with emotion. The day our son was born, it was pouring rain. In the delivery room, I clung to a photo of Matthew he had given me. The doctor said I was exhausted and that they would have to perform a cesarean section. In my blurry consciousness, I only remember saying one thing: "Do whatever it takes, but please save my baby." 3 hours later, I woke up in the recovery room. The first thing I saw was Matthew's face, emaciated but radiant, and next to me, a little angel sleeping peacefully. "It's a boy. You did very well, my love," he whispered in my ear. I extended my hand and touched my son's cheek. At that moment, I knew that at the end of a long, difficult, and tearful journey, I had finally found true happiness. We named him Leo, hoping that, just as he had been a beacon of hope for us, he could also be a bright light in the lives of others. 3 months later, we found out that Mr. Blackwood had passed away. The will did not change again, and there were no more letters or news. He left in silence like a shadow. I looked at Matthew. He didn't cry. He just said softly, "I hope he is in peace wherever he is." We did not go to the funeral, not out of hatred, but because we had already said goodbye a long time ago. Now, every morning I wake up to the singing of birds and the laughter of my son and the sound of Matthew's keyboard writing his second book. The small house on the hill, the man in the wheelchair, the woman who once wanted to flee, and a plump baby have become a normal family, but one as solid as a mountain. Someone asks me, "If you had the chance to choose again, would you marry a paraplegic man?" And I answer with a smile, I didn't choose him just once. I choose him every day of my life. Dear subscribers, sometimes what makes us strong is not our two legs, but a heart that rises again, even after being wounded. And what builds a family is not wealth, but mutual trust, companionship, and the courage to hold hands tightly when the storm comes. The daughter-in-law, who once considered herself sold for a debt, was the only person who stayed by Matthew's side when everyone else turned their backs on him. And Matthew, who seemed to have lost everything, was the one who protected her integrity until the end. They didn't need a mansion or an inheritance. They had something much more valuable, a real home. In life, sometimes we find ourselves in trouble. We are misunderstood, betrayed, and even rejected by our closest ones. But if we don't lose our purity of heart, live correctly, and love with sincerity, life without a doubt will grant us the ending we deserve. Thank you for listening until the end. If today's story has resonated in your heart, subscribe to the Secret Channel of the Heart. We will continue to share deeper and more meaningful stories. Look at the people next to you a little closer, a little deeper. Sometimes happiness is not about having everything, but about having that person by your side and enough love. I wish you all health and peaceful and happy days with your loved ones.